2 years after the murder of their prophet Joseph Smith at the hands of an angry mob, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, led now by Brigham Young, sought to find refuge and establish Zion in the Rocky Mountains. Young stated that he was looking for a place on this earth that nobody else wants. After a harsh, grueling 1,000-mile trek through the great Midwestern plains and imposing Rocky Mountains, Young and his band of explorers came into view of the Salt Lake Valley. Weakened by an intense mountain fever, Brigham Young mustered his strength, sat up, looked over the Salt Lake Valley and stated, "This is the place. Drive on." As Young declared this is the place, there were lingering concerns that for once the Mormons had found a home. In each case, Smith's settlements had become a source of local controversy and eventually targets of persecution. Sometimes they were burned to the ground, often looted by mobs, and in each case for the Mormons, relatively short-lived. The states and the federal government turned a blind eye to mob actions, or in the case of Missouri, Governor Boggs issued an extermination order that applied to any Mormons in his state. This is an important history to know to understand the motivations behind the Mormon rebellion and their willingness to stand up against federal forces, which will be a major topic. Each movement by the members had been harsh and unforgiving, and many were weary of traveling 1,500 miles westward only to look at being displaced again. Young had multiple options for westward settlement: the rain-soaked northwest, south to Arizona or Mexico, even north into Canada. However, to keep his people and church free from displacement again, Young sought seclusion. The Great Basin was secured by large mountains, land for farming that would take effort to prepare, ample water, and no desired by westward explorers looking for gold, homesteads, or traditional settlements. As Heber Bolton recorded, "For the main seat of the saints, the forbidding desert fitted for Young's grim purpose. There," Brigham wrote, "will require hard labor, and consequently will other people, while it's surrounding by so unpopulous, but in the basin of all places the Mormons would be unmolested and have elbow room into which to expand." Utah and the Salt Lake Valley was not the paradise Mormons members had hoped for, as they had come from the fertile valleys of the Midwest. In order to steal them, Young pronounced, "We have been kicked out of the frying pan, into the fire, out of the fire, and into the middle of the floor. And here we are, here we will stay. God has shown me this is a spot to locate his people, and here is where they will prosper. As the saints gathered here and get strong enough to possess the land, God will temper the climate, and we shall build a city and a temple to the Most High God. We'll extend our settlements to the east and to the west and to the north and to the south, and we will build towns and cities by the hundreds, and thousands of saints will gather from the nations of the earth. This will become the great highway of nations." Brigham Young also expressed the desire for the Mormons to become self-sufficient from the rest of the world. Young wanted the members to farm their own food, build their own tools, homes, schools, hospitals, and anything else that would allow for them to build their version of Zion. While Young wanted to establish isolation from what the church considered Gentiles, he was also a skilled mercantilist. He expected to make the saints independent by producing everything they needed. Young hoped to develop a favorable balance of trade with outsiders because he knew eventually his people would have to be open to trade to secure outside goods and develop a working economy. Young expected to draw the commerce of the world to Utah, and his settlement quickly became a major passway to the rest of the West. Although still weak and recovering from the illness that had struck him down on the journey into the Salt Lake Valley, Brigham Young went to work immediately on designing and laying out how the Mormons should settle into their new homes. On July 26, just days removed from entering the valley, Brigham Young and a close group of advisors climbed a peak at the north end of the valley. This peak is now known as Ensign Peak. From this point, Young envisioned where he would build his temple to his God and mapped out how roads should be wide enough to turn a wagon team around without resorting to profanity. Renowned urbanist, architect, and writer Andres Dunay, at a conference in Salt Lake City, lectured that Brigham Young was a master of management and the Henry Ford of urbanism. When Salt Lake City and other Utah towns began, Young used the system called the Plat of Zion, or the Mormon Grid. Young and the early settlers managed to build more than 700 successful cities and towns in a period of 100 years, a feat not matched even by the great empires in world history. In addition, they did it while they were poor. Today in many cities throughout the Mountain West, the grid design is still noticeable from high points and peaks. Navigation through Salt Lake City and surrounding cities is made easy by a numerical north, south, east, west numbering system that starts at the downtown temple and spreads throughout the valley. Within 8 years of the Mormons entering the Salt Lake Valley, all the fertile land had been settled and populated. Young had envisioned a massive empire for his church and set out groups of colonists throughout the Rocky Mountain areas. He did not just send men, he sent families. This was an abnormal state compared to most of the early settlements of the West, where men would sometimes outnumber females 2 to 1 and 3 to 1. Mormon families were also counseled to have large families, and this helped to firmly establish and allow for towns or a city to stabilize and grow quickly. Furthermore, Young would ensure that men with learned trade skills would accompany those settlers in order to teach and train the people in the ways of farming, construction, smithing, and mercantile activities. This would allow for the town to establish trade and offer products and services to those around them, creating needed hubs. On March 4, 1849, the ecclesiastical officials of the Mormon Church met and established a provisional constitution for what was known at the time as the State of Deseret, or a Book of Mormon term that meant honeybee, signifying industry and cooperation. As an interesting side note, the beehive is still the state logo and is found throughout Utah governmental buildings and on the state flag. Eager to establish a functioning government, elections were held on March 12th, and Brigham Young was elected as the governor of the state of Deseret. The rest of the state government was naturally seated with ecclesiastical officials, and over the next 9 years, Brigham Young and his government would run the state as they saw fit. As it is worth noting, Young had the expectation for his state to be a Mormon state within the United States, thus the title State of Deseret. That, of course, did not happen, and Young would not see the admittance of the state of Utah in his lifetime. Young did petition President Polk in Congress to allow for his state to become a member of the Union, but there was great debate on the overall size, style of government, and what would make up the state. President Polk was also not in favor of allowing Young to be the territorial governor, and sought changes without success. Eventually, President Fillmore and Congress appointed Young as territorial governor, although Fillmore had deep reservations as to Young's loyalty to the rest of the country because of his past hostile statements about the federal government. Even more so, much of the nation had strong feelings against the Mormons because of their practice of polygamy, and the subject of polygamy was a constant source of contention between the Mormons and government. Because of these issues, Fillmore appointed a number of non-Mormons to help manage the state and keep Young in line, and federal judges to run the territorial courts. Cooperation with the appointees may have worked out if the federal officials were more understanding of the Mormons' plight. Instead, men like Judge Broncos had been appointed and stirred tensions by openly making comments during a speech before the Mormons' General Conference that the federal government was not responsible, nor should have it intervened in the expulsion of Mormons by violence from Illinois and Missouri. Further, Broncos challenged that the Mormons' patriotism was quite critical of the practice of plural marriage. Broncos' speech had also amply demonstrated that the federal appointees had little tact for addressing the Mormons. After Broncos' speech, Young responded vigorously. Secretary Harris reportedly stated that the Mormons should not be treated as civilized people. Afterward, Broncos and a number of the federal officials fled the territory, stating that they feared for their safety, further inflaming tensions with Young and the federal government. Without many of the appointees left in the territory, the federal government had trouble trying to rein in Young's power and authority over the state. The displaced federal officers reported to President Fillmore that Young was a law unto himself and that he ruled as he pleased, as no man would dare oppose him because of his ecclesiastical position. Furthermore, these officials made allegations that various murders had been committed with the direct approval of church leaders, to which they offered no proof or evidence to back up these claims. President Fillmore was petitioned by the federal advisors to remove Young as the territorial governor. Their opposition to Young's governorship was based upon views that there was a lack of separations of power and that Young refused to listen to or heed to the will of the federal government and the continued practice of polygamy. When President Buchanan was elected, he was willing to challenge the Mormon state and Brigham Young. Buchanan stated after reviewing the reports that there was no government in Utah, but only the despotism of Brigham Young. William W. Drummond provided much of the information reported about Young to Buchanan. Historians have found that the implications of Drummond charges that the Mormons implicitly followed Brigham Young dictates was false. And in fact, Young struggled to rein in the wealthier Mormon church members, although when the army was sent to Utah, Young did come down hard on the church to get them in line with his dictates. Drummond's allegations were the leading reasons in which Buchanan listed as his justification for sending in the army. Unfortunately for the Mormons, Drummond had a history of anti-Mormon bias and constantly was at odds with the church over polygamy. Nonetheless, this burning and contentious feud between the federal government and Young would eventually escalate into what is now known as the Utah War or Mormon Rebellion. The contentions with the federal government and its federal representatives within the Utah Territory lasted for almost 10 years before events turned to a point of armed confrontation over power and authority between the civil religious leadership of the Utah Territory and the administration of James Buchanan. It did not help that in the summer of 1856, with the Atlantic coast of Washington anti-Mormon sentiment because of their practice of polygamy and their odd religious beliefs. While it was almost lost as a footnote in the history of the United States, the Utah War or Mormon Rebellion was the nation's first civil war, but the third Mormon conflict only in 20 years, these conflicts mainly consisting of Mormons being driven from their homes in the Midwest by mobs and under the order of state governors. The Utah War pitted the Nauvoo Legion, Utah's large territorial militia, against nearly one-third of the U.S. Army, and it was the nation's most extensive and expensive military undertaking during the period between the Mexican and Civil Wars. May of 1857, Buchanan had ordered that the U.S. Army to escort a new governor to Utah to replace Brigham Young and serve as a posse comitatus in asserting federal law in the vast theocratic territory. Brigham Young's explosive reaction would ignite the 1857 to 1858 Utah War and prevent for 8 months the arrival of the U.S. troops. If they can send a force against this people, we have every constitutional and legal right to send them to hell, and we calculate to send them there, Young thundered. On September 15, 1857, acting as governor after his term has expired and before his appointed successor arrived, he proclaimed martial law. Young ordered the territorial militia to repel the invasion and shut down travel without a permit into, through, or from a region in the American West. This call to action led to the tragic events, the Mountain Meadow Massacre. On September 11, 1857, approximately 120 men, women, and children fell victim to one of the largest domestic acts of terrorism ever witnessed on North American soil. The Francher Baker Wagon Company was traveling through Utah on its way to California. Tensions of the region were high as marauders had been raiding Native American settlements and is suspected of poisoning of a spring by the wagon train that resulted in the death of cattle and 2 Mormon settlers in the region. Ultimately, a raiding party made up of Paiute Indians and Mormons dressed as Native Americans attacked the company and fought a pitched 5-day battle. Eventually, the wagon train ran out of ammo and water and attempted to surrender. Members of the attacking party feared the survivors knew who they were and decided to kill all the remaining of them, only sparing young girls and children. Some historians have claimed that Young had ordered the attack upon the Francher Baker wagon train, but there is no definitive proof of him even being aware of the events until days later. Most historians blame the war upon hysteria that had fermented in the state with the approaching federal army. After a few minor skirmishes with the federal army on the way to Utah, the war ended peacefully on June 1858, when Young, who was under indictment for treason, and other Mormon leaders accepted the president's offer of a pardon to all U.S. citizens who would submit to the laws, and Young stepped down as governor. The war's legacy is still apparent in the exclusive nature of Mormon culture and the distrustful attitude towards the federal government that makes Utah one of the country's most conservative states. Brigham Young was a complicated man. He was a great organizer, colonizer, antagonist, and merchant. He established a thriving city in the middle of a desert valley that is growing and expanding to this day. Much of his life was mired in controversy and misunderstandings of his religion and its odd teachings and practices. Aside from his colonization of Utah, he was responsible for the founding and settlement of over 350 towns and cities. He helped to finish the Transcontinental Railroad, founded 2 universities, built 4 large temples to his God, with the most recognizable being the Salt Lake Temple, a world-renowned Gothic architectural masterpiece, which took 40 years to construct. Brigham Young never did get to see the temple completed in his life, as he died August 29, 1877, leaving behind him a legacy that is still felt throughout the Rocky Mountains.